Did you all think a little bit more about what you ate for lunch than what you ate for breakfast? Fantastic. So we've had a great first half of our day here. Thanks again so much for sharing your day with us here at the CropLife America National Policy Conference. We started, as you probably noticed, on the food chain at the farm, and we've been moving up the food chain. Heard from some farmers in the first panel. Allie's kept us on track, keeping the perspective of communicating all along the way. We heard from Seth Goldman, who is a great success story around having an entrepreneurial idea that jumps into a global business platform connected to food and beverage, responding and reacting to consumer demands and feedback. You've been tweeting, thank you very much. Some of you have been on Facebook. We appreciate that whole commitment to being here in person and virtually. So, how was lunch? Everybody get enough to eat? Fantastic. So, next we're going to focus a little bit more around that next part of the food chain, which is the communications part, that full-time commitment to the right stuff, as we've titled this next session, and ask Allie to join our next set of panelists to delve a little bit deeper into this business of communicating, of being engaged in the media, whether it's new media or conventional, traditional media. And I thought I would just ask, how many of you have been interviewed by a conventional media source? Raise your hands. And how many of you by television? Been on television? So lots of veterans here, Allie. So most of us who have had a considerable amount of media experience know that you never really know what to expect, but you need to be prepared for anything. And yet, reporters are people too. So it really is an opportunity for us in this next section of our program to interface with those that do this for a living and get a little bit better understanding about that very important interface with regard to farming, food, and the consuming public. So I'll turn the platform back over to you, Allie, and take it away.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. I hope you enjoyed lunch. I made no friends with corn people before lunch, but I did actually make friends with the corn people over lunch. I spent most of it talking to David Knowles, who had asked those very challenging questions, and we agreed to have a very good sit down and compare our notes about the issue of high fructose corn syrup. And then I had lots of great conversations with a lot of people. And I guess the takeaway from that is that you people need to be poked a little to get involved. So please do. I really would like to see a few people at the mics. You ask good questions. I'm seeing them on Twitter. We're getting them on email. Just ask them. This is interesting. It's not a useful. Oh, can't you hear me?
Are we supposed to turn it on?
Hello. Is that better?
They're on.
Yeah? This is on?
It's
Oh. I heard me. This is not really useful if you show up and have conversations with people who feel exactly the same way as you do about these matters. I will also say I am not as convinced as most of you are that you get a bad media rap. I think the news, people tell me this about everything, by the way. It's like, why don't you people do some more good news? And my answer is because you wouldn't watch. It's not entirely true, but it's mostly true. We don't really, it's just very hard to sustain 3 days of live breaking news coverage on lettuce that didn't make people sick. But really, news is about things that happen out of the ordinary. Sometimes it's really good, and that's the technological advances or the small farmer that made it or the cows that milk themselves, and sometimes it's bad. It's the cow that went into the milking thing the wrong way, and it was disastrous, and the food that didn't work out the right way. So the point is, I truly, as a consumer of news as well as a purveyor of it, just don't think that the rap is as bad as you think it is. I think what happens is that people don't know all of the nuances and complexities and textures of the industry that you're in, and we want people to know those things, but they don't really care. They want it to be safe, they want it to be ample, they want it to be affordable, and they want it to be enjoyable. The example I gave somebody a few minutes ago is that I'm Canadian. I'd really like people to like us more. I'd really like you all to care more. But generally telling people you're Canadian elicits a blank stare. It's not that when people tell you something about Olympics and the hockey and Mounties and whatever, Beavers, but the fact is, it doesn't really matter that you don't have a remarkably, overwhelmingly positive understanding of what makes Canada operate and how it's different from you. It just doesn't matter. You buy a lot of our stuff. You provide us with really close places to get x-rays if we need one in less than 6 months. Like, it's fine. So, but I want to examine that because I'm going to bring journalists up here. So let's do that. Let's bring the journalists up and we can talk to, but again, these are the people that cover it. So if you do not ask these people questions in the course of the next hour, I don't want to hear from you people again. Like, I don't want to hear that you don't think the coverage is good. This is your chance. This is your chance to say, why do you do things the way you do? Why do you tell these stories? Ask me, ask the others. So let's have this conversation. I want to bring up Beth Hoffman from the University of San Francisco, Jenny Hopkinson from Politico Pro, and Michele Simon, the president of Eat, Drink, Politics. All right, now, welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. One of the questions that we've been addressing throughout the day has to do with consumer and trust issues. Obviously, with agriculture and food production, trust issues are really at the top of the list of things. Affordability issues and supply issues are there, but trust really has to be at the top. We had that conversation with our farmers earlier, our ranchers, about the fact that it's important that people know who these people are. Even if they don't really know them personally, they know who they are. But most people in America probably get their information about food through the media in some fashion. So we asked some questions of folks out there. Let's play the video. But I want to start by asking. Let me ask you, Jenny, to start with, but I'll ask Beth as well, and whoever wants to answer this. In the case of both Forbes and Politico, they're introducing more stuff, more columns, more articles, sections devoted to things like food and agriculture. I know when I was at CNN, we launched a food blog that became very, very popular. What's the reason for this? Is it because you have to have a full portfolio of stuff, or because there's consumer demand for it?
Well, I think it's more of the second part. I mean, we launched our food and agriculture section in October as part of kind of a growing portfolio of policy areas that Politico chose to address. And I mean, it does say something that, I think it's consumer driven. I think consumers have started being more concerned about what's in their food and where their food comes from. And as a result, kind of the media has to start taking more notice, and Capitol Hill has started taking more notice. But I mean, we're certainly not the only ones. I think there's been an uptick in food and food and agriculture policy coverage, kind of across the board. And you're seeing a lot of big names at the New York Times and the Associated Press as a reporter. So yeah, I think it's consumer driven. But to one of the people in the video said, consumers don't have a sway on Capitol Hill, but I mean, they are, because now these food and agriculture issues that maybe the food industry and the agriculture industry don't want to touch are getting a presence on Capitol Hill. So I disagree with that, and I think the media coverage of it and the growing media coverage of it is a reflection of that as well.
Beth?
I think that's an important point that you make that I don't think people understand, is that most media outlets have now created their own food, in-house food reporting. NPR, for example, has hired a food person who's doing the on-radio stuff. They've started their own blog. The New York Times, obviously, doing tons of it. But even at Forbes, I think that was interesting that they asked me to blog for them, not really being someone who has been well known for, pro-business, Forbes-type writing. So I think a lot of these the media organizations are looking to get much wider coverage, more varied opinions in the same place to provide that, because that is something that their readers want, but also because they realize that it is such a huge kind of separate issue. I think
Right.
food maybe was under other umbrellas until the last.
Well, it was social. It was a lot of food coverage was social
was like
coverage.
culture.
It was culture. It was restaurants. It was recipes. It was, and then it would branch out into things. And now there's a lot more policy involved in this. Michele, tell me about what you do and how this has evolved, given this newfound interest.
Yeah. Well, I think obviously the role of the internet, I think that's a funny remark. The internet is not a source. And unfortunately, there are a lot of bad sources on the internet. But I know for me, I mean, I'm not a journalist per se. I am a writer, and I've written a real book, you know, with pages in it. And the old-fashioned way. And I used to write magazine articles and op-eds and real newspapers. And then, of course, the internet made all that kind of passé, and now I have my own blog, and I blog at Huffington Post, and actually occasionally at Al Jazeera America on their opinion page, and you know, there's just so much more, many more ways to get information. But I do share some concerns that not all sources are good just because they're readily available.
Here's what I want to put out to you, because one of the conversations I ended up having at lunch a lot was, and I'll put this to all of you, at what point do perceptions about food and agriculture, how do we balance perceptions about food and agriculture based on various sources versus the science that so many people in this room are interested in the audience, in the broader audience knowing about, given that we like to do this on every front, but people sometimes just don't care about the science. They care about their perceptions.
Oh, am I first? You know, it's a really good question, and obviously things should be driven by the science, but I think one of the things about food and agriculture is that currently what's going on is a conversation. And whether or not, you know, and certainly maybe not all parts of the conversation are as driven by science, but given that it is a conversation, there's a lot of instances where all sides of that conversation do deserve a voice in reporting of it. And you know, but then I think there's a time and a place for that, I guess is what I'm saying.
Beth, we had a question that was tweeted earlier that I didn't really understand, and I put it to Jesse, who kind of got where we were going with this. But it was really the question, if it weren't limited by a tweet, would have been, how do you, in the debates about food and agriculture, determine what weight you give to various sides in an issue? And I think the implication of the question was, do you treat things as equal? Do you treat people who have different views on things as equal? And of course, as journalists, this is something we come up with against all the time, because someone will have a view, and we have to determine, does that carry the same weight as science or companies that say otherwise? So how do you make these determinations when you come up against polarizing issues in food and agriculture?
I mean, I think that it's not something that journalists like to talk about in terms of bias, and, you know, are we biased, and who you're writing for is going to bias you, and liberal media and conservative media. But I mean, we all as human beings have sort of a bias, and we have our preconceived notions about what is happening. So I think that to try and remove that and pretend that journalists could somehow be removed from all of that is a tricky notion. That being said, you know, I think that at the same time, as a journalist, our job is to kind of step away from information. So, you know, people were asking me, how do I get ideas for what I write about? And I'm sent stuff, you know, there's like a steady stream. My inbox is just a disaster. It's a nightmare, because it's just like one thing after another that people are sending me. And you get trusted sources, you have particular issues of interest, and that's kind of where it starts, you know, but it shouldn't end there as journalists. A lot of us don't. I work at the University of San Francisco full time because I don't make enough money as a journalist to just do journalism. So I love my job at USF as well. But so that means that I don't have oodles of time to then make, you know, phone calls all around and check everything. And that's unfortunately the reality of a lot of blogging. That's what I feel like the blogosphere, it's for better or for worse, it ends up being very, you know, nut graph synthesis, little, you know, blurbs about the information. places that have now full-time food reporters and people who can spend time looking into it, that's a different whole world. So I think that it's different. And I think that the idea about, do we like, what about science and where does science fit in? And we were even speaking about this at lunch. And I've written about this in terms of genetic engineering. I don't think that people particularly care about the science anymore. And I've written that, and I was attacked for it on the blog for saying that. But I think, science has a credibility problem. People have been using it to back whatever they want to say. It's a little bit like statistics. You can find something to say that it's safe or it's good or it's healthy. And I think that a lot of people have made up their mind. They don't want genetic engineering, not because of the science behind it.
Because they just don't want it.
Because I think it's heading, I think a lot of people feel like it's heading society, consumers in a direction that they have said they don't really want to go, which is further industrialized, further synthesized.
Michele, I know you want to get in, but I want to just keep on going with this for 1 second. This is a point of contention in this room. There's no question. So I want to just go forward with this a little bit. In this room, I have heard more than a few people say that imply, these are my words, that if your science, or if you can't prove that there's something wrong with my science or my GMO, you're not really, you shouldn't be in the game that much. You shouldn't get that kind of credibility from journalists. You shouldn't get that kind of credibility in the debate. I mean, again, I'm freely paraphrasing, but I suspect there are some of you, in fact, is there anybody who thinks that they've heard that in this room or that kind of conversation? Okay. So what do we do about that?
Well, can I just jump in on
Yeah.
the science issue because, I get this, you're right. I mean, this is a problem. And I feel like, it's not as simple as saying, we industry people know the science and you crazy activists should just stop talking. I mean, that's really the kind of conversation we're having right now. And it's so not helpful, and it's so, I was just in another meeting, it was actually with the Union of Concerned Scientists, where we had a similar conversation about the role of science. And, there are people, in different contexts suffering at the community level from, not having access to fresh food, and they don't need scientists to come in and study that for them, right? So sometimes science just doesn't even have the answer. And when it comes to biotech, I mean, science is political, right? I mean, it's not just as simple as saying, well, I know the science and you don't. And I feel like we need to have a different conversation in order to find some common ground. I mean, and I agree there's people, in the anti-camp that don't necessarily understand science, but I don't think it's helpful to put them down and be condescending and say, you stupid idiots, we know the science better than you. And that's where I really think that conversation needs to stop.
Can I actually jump in on
Sure,
that?
please,
And
yeah.
I
Everybody
actually-
jump in. This is good.
I mean, and
Check for tweets.
I've written a lot about, and I think this is happening, or at least there's an acknowledgement, and if anyone in the room wants to stone me for saying this, that's fine, but that the biotechnology industry fell behind in explaining what it was doing to the average consumer, because let's face it, they are agricultural companies that were tasked with solving agricultural problems, and that's what they set out to do. And so in that process, they never said to the consumers, like, this is what we're doing, this is how it works, and this is how it can benefit you. And so I actually think there's been a lot of work done on turning that around. And I think, Rob Fraley at Monsanto has been a big spokesman for it. There's been a lot of efforts across the board. Bio is also, kind of launching and trying to engage in these conversations. And it's a slow process, because how do you turn around this kind of years of pent up consumer what's going on and curiosity, and then of course the kind of more terrifying end of the kind of anti-GMO movement. But I think there is movement in that direction to stop that conversation, because there's acknowledgement that it's...
But do you think there's a credibility problem?
Well, but how do you get around that, though? I mean, I see your point, but at the same time, like,
I know. I wonder, can we get past? I mean, I feel like right now it's loggerheads, right? People are...
Well, so the credibility problem being that consumers won't believe companies because, companies made these products and...
Well, they do have a vested interest. I mean,
Well, yeah.
that's the type of writing I do, is to say, well, I'm kind of watching the conversation, and I think it's important to really unpack, well, who is bringing that message? So, what industry tends to do is tap into academics who come with credibility, right? And that's really where then the science kind of gets, hidden, if you will, because if, Monsanto was paying an academic for science that benefits them, then that's a certain kind of science. And I'm not saying that all corporate paid for science is biased, and I'm not saying that some science done by, advocates on the other side can't be biased, but I'm just saying that's why it's not just as simple as
It's not simple.
science.
If you remember on the first panel that we had this morning, the last question was a gentleman from the University of Maryland who was asking a question about the importance of continued funding from land-grant universities, which have really helped bolster or debunk science that has been, produced for companies. In some cases, it's good. In some cases, the science is good. In some cases, it's whatever you want it to be. And so I guess this is the interesting thing. You said science is like statistics, and it is. We can find an argument, I suspect. We can all defend or object to a particular perspective. But I want to ask you about this, Beth. Jenny said consumers don't necessarily trust where the information is coming from, and that's what you were speaking to, Michele. But consumers on every front, not just in agriculture, consumers on every front have reason to not trust big anything. Mm-hmm. Big banks, big agriculture, big airlines, big oil, big everything. Big government. We just don't trust people, so we're not going to necessarily believe it, even if, sorry, Monsanto, the research comes from Monsanto or anybody. I mean, and I think consumers are right to now be skeptical. I don't know that they even trust us. I mean, the truth is,
the media is
we're not any higher on these lists. But how do you address that? How do you deal with the fact that people are hungry for information about agriculture and about food production, but they don't know where to go?
Well, I mean, it's a very tricky question. I would say, there's a balance. Like, this knowing information only goes so far. I think that's why the know your farmer kind of idea has gained traction, I believe, is because
it's understandable.
People feel
clear,
like
yeah.
if you know somebody, and we've found that, right, sitting at the table with somebody who you thought was the enemy or whatever the discussion was last night, they're then humanized and they're a person, right? So there's a different kind of trust there. But I don't know that people, I think personally, one of the things that I think that we've done in the media, and I think that corporate America is now really honed in on, is this idea of storytelling. Like, we've got to tell our story, and then people will like us because of the story, and there's your packaging with the green grass and the cows are milling around. And I think that's a bit of a disservice to consumers and our readers, because to tell a story, that can be co-opted. And I'll use the example of the whole McDonald's scheme of, we're going to have these videos now showing our farmers, which completely blew up in social media. It went horribly wrong. But the problem with focusing on only story and only knowing your farmer is that there's no substance to it. So you have to have somehow a mix of those things. You've got to humanize and scientize at the same time, but mixing those in a articulate manner, I think, is our job, really, because you can't just have one or the other.
Michele, what's the story, if you get away from the audience that knows the stories and knows the stuff that the perennial stuff that comes up, the discussions we all have, and if you set aside the GMO discussion for a second, for the purpose of setting it aside because it's polarized and it is what it is, what's the story that we as journalists should be telling? What's the agriculture story that's important to be talking about?
Well, I think there's an assumption built into a lot of the defensiveness that I feel in the room, which is that, some of us who have started to write about the problems with our current food system, we're kind of coming into a blank slate, right? As if, everything was fine until Mark Bittman came along, or, So I want to just say that there are real problems with the environment, with public health that, in some way, shape, or form are related to how food is produced and sold. And so, I want the conversation, to answer your question, I want journalists to really know who is bringing what message and what their motivation is, and to identify the sources of information, because I do feel like there's a lot of spin going on. And why people don't trust is because, when industry puts up a website, as if that's the answer to the problem, what's wrong with the food system isn't a lack of communication, right? And that's really been industry's response. Oh, we're not telling our story. Oh, we haven't put up the right website. Oh, gee, we've been calling it biotech. We should really call it GMOs because that's what the crazy activists are calling it. I mean, come on, right? I mean, we're not falling for that. So I want an honest conversation. I think journalists should be calling out that kind of thing when the next front group gets formed. And this is the kind of thing I shine a light on. I have a real problem when another front group, which means a group that is hiding behind something that sounds good, right? My poster child is hopefully not in this room, but the Center for Consumer Freedom, right? Classic front group, sounds great. They use the American flag in their logo. Well, it's really backed by industry. And I just want all of that sheen, all of that PR, all that spin to go away. And let's be honest. Let's say, you know what? There are problems that Michelle Obama didn't invent, that Mark Bittman didn't invent, that none of us who are complaining invented. And let's maybe even work together to find solutions.
But that's going to be our job too. And I mean, that's something that I tell my staff all the time, that any name that sounds like that, we've got to say who they are and who funds them. Because this is now the new thing in America, right? Names that sound like absolutely nothing. Super PACs, they all sound really good. They're all just here to defend America. It's fantastic. Jenny, what do you think isn't being covered? Or what would you like to see? How would you like to see the discussion framed?
I mean, I think there are a lot of things not being covered, and I shouldn't point them out because then I should probably cover them.
It's going to make you very busy.
I mean, let's be blunt
And
about
by the
that.
way, I'm going to put this to you as well out there. So if you want to go up to the mic or you want to tweet it, what would you like to be covered in light of what these folks are saying?
Oh, and also email me about it because I'm curious. But in light of that, and I think one of the things that's happened is, consumers have always called for affordable, abundant food. And so the food and agriculture industry has responded by creating affordable, abundant food. And then in the past couple of years, you've now seen consumers who still want their affordable, abundant food, but now want to know everything that's in it. And so and unfortunately, you can't turn a cruise ship around on a dime. And kind of whether or not the food industry and the agriculture industry has done that the right way is up for debate. But I think that's the situation where we're in, that this has been the case for so long, and now all of a sudden there's these questions on it. And so how do you turn that around? And also, how do you keep things affordable? I mean, one of the things I do think that hasn't been brought into the debate enough is food prices, because isn't that what's driving a lot of these things and a lot of the technology and a lot of the food additives that we're using? It's a pricing issue because consumers demand cheap food. So, and going back to the idea of, let's be honest, unfortunately, and Beth said it, journalists have opinions as well. So, you can't have a food company or a biotech company or and at a table because they do have an opinion, that they do have shareholders, they do have a purpose. So I don't know the answer to that question because I don't know how you have that at the table, and I do think there needs to be kind of more common ground in between it. But it's a.
But it makes me feel like there's. I mean, as I hear this conversation continuing, it makes me feel that there's really more of a failure on our part. That this is hard work. This kind of journalism is hard work because it's complicated. It's nuanced, it's textured, and by the way, in some cases, you're working against very highly financed spin machines. And as Beth said, we're people. As Jay said, we're people too. So we come with our own biases, and unlike a lot of beats that journalists cover, we all intersect with this one very, very closely. So Beth, you talked about it. I'm going to push you a little bit on this. What are the biases you struggle with in covering this? Because you can't be value neutral on this.
I don't get to say what I think should be covered.
You could do that. And then you can answer the second part of the
All right.
question.
Well, I think that covering the sort of how we've gotten here, like where we are, and how we've gotten here, is something that I would like to cover a lot more if I had just time to just be a journalist.
What do you mean by that?
I mean by that there's sort of this concept in the media often where it was like the time before, when things were the grassy green hills and the cows
Red barn.
roaming and the red barn
Right.
idea, and like the evolution of it. My husband's family, he's from Iowa, and I've spent a lot of time interviewing, just sitting down one-on-one with his relatives and kind of learning about just like, how did this happen? How are you here that you're growing GMO corn and soy and have cattle, and what happened? What was the evolution to that? What was your great-grandparents? What did they do? And so I think like that whole evolution is a fascinating story that we haven't told, and it kind of rationalizes, it makes it kind of clear, like, oh, there are actually reasons why people made these choices along the road and how we ended up here. So I think that that's important, and with students particularly, I feel like that's something that I really want to explore more. So my biases.
I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm
Yeah.
trying to say, what are the things that challenge us? Because it's very hard to go. When I cover a hurricane, I don't have to worry about my biases. It's fine for me to say that a hurricane is bad when it destroys people's livelihoods, or a tornado is, or a mass murder is. But when you come in to talk about food, you can't just be this reporter that says interesting things about food, right? You have to figure out what the cleavages and the tension points are,
Yeah.
and you come with some of them.
Yeah, I think there's always, this tendency, especially when you're sent something in a press release, that it sounds like, oh, it's all kind of cleaned up. It's pretty clean, this thing, and I'm just going to report on it as it's written here. And I think like that always kind of interrogating, like, well, what would be the other side? Who is the other side of this? And trying to make that phone call or that email to get who is on the other side of this, who are the stakeholders in this issue. I had a recent press release where someone said, why are our athletes, being supported, our Olympic athletes are tweeting for fast food companies, and this is wrong. And I thought, yeah, that's wrong. And then I thought, well, let's ask the athletes. And once I asked the athletes, and I got responses from them, and I wrote the article, the NGO who had originally sent me that said, wow, that was fantastic, because I never even thought to think about why are the athletes doing that. Mm-hmm. And so, it's I think, and most people would say, oh, well, the NGO doesn't probably care. But of course, everybody wants to. It humanizes it again. It makes it clear, like the athlete's not just doing it to be, a rich jerk selling hamburgers and sodas, right? There's like reasons behind it that they feel are justified as well.
So I want to, and again, I invite you all, just stand up at the mic if you've got a question. I'll find you. And you should have questions, because we're being provocative and somewhat nasty. I want to push this conversation with you guys a little bit further, because so what I've heard is this generalized speak truth to power, look through the spin, tell the real story, look at the other side of it, all of which is sound journalism. I also worry that in a room like this, we think people care more about some of this stuff than they actually do. As I said earlier, I don't know, other than when the sausage gives you salmonella, I don't think anybody cares all that much about how much the sausage is made. What are the bigger implications of the story of food and agriculture in this country that we need to talk about? You touched on it with price, right? Price and abundance. Price and abundance are obviously top of the list. Availability, supply chain. But nobody really wants to know a supply chain story about food. Everybody here wants to talk about supply chain, but in fact, the consumer just needs to know it's going to be there. Is there a trend or an implication that you see down the road that we as journalists should really be latching onto? Again, in my world, I have two that I've sort of latched onto. One is water. Which just for various reasons between energy and drought seem to be really affecting a lot of farmers. And two is the sustainability of a small farm. I don't know whether it's important that we sustain small farms. It's nice. I don't know that it is, but I think we have to keep on examining this because it's harder and harder to be a small farmer. Are there issues that stand out, and any of you can address this, that if you set all of this aside, all of these people's issues and their press releases aside, that we need to be telling the public that's really important about agriculture and food?
Well, I would say the issue of poverty is probably of utmost importance, because what I see happening are these parallel tracks with sort of this alternative food movement that's growing and is, I'm able to shop at my local farmers market, but just a couple of miles in West Oakland, near where I live, there are people who don't have that ability. And I feel like that gets to the core of this, debate that we often have about, well, people can eat healthy if they would only choose to, and if, we're giving them all these choices, and they just need to go shop at that farmer's market when it's not even in their neighborhood and they can't afford to. And you're right that people want cheap food, but we don't pay people living wage, right? And so when I hear in this room, well, there's hungry people, or that we don't understand what hungry is, well, actually, I do connect with people in communities who understand what hungry is, and they're not asking for GMOs to solve their hunger problem. They're asking for a goddamn supermarket in their neighborhood, and they're asking for a living wage to be able to afford truly healthy food, not just the secondhand remains, So I feel like the conversation needs to be brought into the role of poverty and how we as a society have really failed most workers who can't even afford to cook because they're too stressed out, and buying real food can be more expensive than stopping at McDonald's. So I feel like that piece of it really needs to be brought out more.
I think that, I think that what consumers care about to a very large extent is the environment, and I think that the environmental implications, water, and the kind of nexus with energy as well, those are giant issues for the public. I also just read a report recently that said that something like 80% of Chinese citizens now consider themselves environmentalists. And this is that can have gigantic implications in terms of what needs to happen with how we grow our food. So I think that that's most on the minds of the public. I think that for me as well, the social implications, not only in our own communities, but in developmentally speaking, and development around the world in low-income areas or in very impoverished areas, is a huge issue that I like to talk about. And I think that whole concept of it's elitist, I think that's a very confusing, very degrading argument, that to say that we don't need biotech is elitist. And somehow if you're pro-biotech, that you're bringing, we can feed the world, which I'm a little bit surprised is that terms, those words are being said here so frequently, because whenever I've brought that up and feeding the world, people say, no, we don't say that anymore. So I think that the social implications worldwide are very, very important to talk about. The more that you make massive commodities and you have people growing sugar in massive amounts, or no matter how good your intention is, you're still creating an environment where people are growing just commodities, and the fluctuations in the market is going to be they're going to be impacted no matter what you do.
The front mic, please.
Hi. So if I take off my trade association hat and put back on my farm daughter hat, and I've followed a lot of efforts like groups like the Ag Chat Foundation and others that really try to promote ag literacy and that whole idea of storytelling. And then on the other hand, really being somebody who has paid attention to the science and follows the science, I want to follow up on the prior conversation and ask your advice. So if science is no longer credible to talk about, and if storytelling is a disservice, and we're looking for a mix somewhere in there, how should we in agriculture, whether we're a trade association, whether we're a lobbyist, whether we're somebody back home on the farm in central Kansas, how should we connect to consumers that are so hungry for that information, which is entirely what we heard all morning?
Great question. What do you do now? We've eliminated half of what everybody in this room does. So now what's left for them?
Well, I mean, I would also, I said we needed a combination of the two, so to be fair. I think that what Megan is doing and transparency, that's it. People want to be able to see and understand what you're doing. And the more that people can come out and see it, and if they can't come out and see it, you are relating that via social media, I think that's what you do. Because the science, as farmers, there's no expectation by the public that you're going to be providing science. You're going to be providing that environment in which we can see that in action. But you're not, I don't think anybody would be looking to the farmer's daughter for, a report on whatever.
It almost becomes suspicious when it happens.
Yeah.
The amount of science generated by this industry often pushes buttons with journalists, certainly does with me. It's why are you working so hard to disprove that theory? Why are you working so hard to do that?
So, and my response is not that science or storytelling should not be part of the communication, but that often those two tools are used to shut down other conversations that some of us think are more important. So when we complain about factory farming and you send Megan to talk about, oh, here, come see my farm, that's great, but that's not really the conversation that we wanted to have, right? And that's my objection to it. It's a PR tool. It's, when it's being used as a PR, I'm not saying that you're being used as a PR tool. I mean, I think it's totally great that you're inviting people to your farm, but not everyone's doing that. Cargill's probably not letting people into their slaughterhouse as far as I'm aware. So I'm just saying it's how the tool is used is important, and when it's to shut down another conversation that is really important to have.
Maybe Cargill should do a custom butcher program. I'm all about it. You can run it. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you for that question. Really good. The back mic, please. Is that on?
We'll see. Now I'm on. Thank you. Thanks to the panel. My name is Darren Kopic. I'm with the Agricultural Retailers Association. We don't represent food retailers. We are retailers to farmers. So we supply farmers, but it's still a retail operation. Two answers to the question you posed, Allie. One, I want to compliment Beth for her remark earlier about talking to the athletes, not just making the assumption about why the athletes are doing what they're doing, but actually asking them and reporting that story. I think that would help us all if we could do some more of that within this space, rather than just assuming that, well, I saw that this technology is bad on Facebook, so it must be. I'm not going to do my homework. I'm not going to go dig up the data to prove or disprove that point of view. I'm just going to accept it and repeat it. If we could all do more homework, I think that'd be really helpful and a good service for journalists to do for the rest of us. On the other side, hang on. You may not like it when I'm done. Somebody remarked that the data from big chemical companies or big seed companies is viewed with suspicion because of who wrote it, who funded it, who designed the protocol, et cetera. And I can understand where a consumer might come to that position because the company does have a vested interest in getting the product out there. They do have requirements from government to do all those studies. Government doesn't have enough resources to do those studies themselves or with a third-party vendor, so the only way you're going to get them paid for is to have the companies do them with the protocols established by the government. But let's also remember that the folks on the other side of the argument also have a vested interest. And that's a story I'd like to hear more often. The organizations that protest against chemicals, protest against seed technology, or anything else in agriculture derive some of their income from fundraising because they scare the crap out of people and get money that way, or because they win legal suits and collect legal fees in repayment that's funded by taxpayers in a lot of cases. And so, yes, there are vested interests, but they're on both sides. And so maybe instead of who funds the study or who did the study, a more appropriate measure would be, is it a good study? Is it peer-reviewed? Is it sound science? And moving beyond the scientific question, what kind of a vision does it paint for the future? Is it a good, compelling vision that we like, or do we have some issues with where that path would lead us?
I think that's absolutely sound. I think that if you take, the industry to task and you hold truth to power, you've got to do that with everybody involved. And I don't think this is specific to this industry, by the way. As you know, every industry does this. Every industry, most large industries fund studies, and the public is distrustful of them, and journalists should be skeptical about them. And we should be skeptical about studies on the other side, too.
Yeah, I guess it just goes back to what I was saying before, which is that it's not as simple as, my science is better than your science. I mean, there's no question. People in public health, I'm embarrassed by it sometimes when they cherry pick the studies to show that, to back up their agenda. Although I will say I don't think they're equal. I don't think it's quite equal to say that the type of bias that creeps in for industry that has an economic incentive is the same as an NGO that, yes, they're raising money, but I don't know, it doesn't feel, I really don't think they're equal, and they're certainly not perceived as equal. And it's not to say that there isn't some bias that creeps in, but I feel like, well, those are kinds of cards that were dealt, and that's why I think we need to get beyond the scientific argument, because it's not going to solve this problem. As important as science is, I really think there's a values disconnect here, right? So when people get upset about GMOs, it's not necessarily because they think that there's a mountain of science to back them up on it. It's because they just don't like what that technology represents. Good or bad, whether you agree with it or not, it's more of a values disconnect than a scientific one.
And should we be doing anything about that? In other words, is it our responsibility in the media to say your values disconnect is more or less valuable than their scientific evidence? In other words, do we legitimize and give credibility to value disconnects? I don't know.
Well, I think they're real. I just think, people don't want high fructose corn syrup. Well, I agree. It's probably not really much worse than sugar, but people don't want it. So, we're kind of stuck with the fact that consumers aren't always scientific in their
Some people don't want gay marriage either.
Well, yeah.
Just saying. Just saying.
I think that
Did I just switch sides on the high fructose corn syrup thing? Can somebody just erase that? Don't anybody tweet what I just said, because wait, now I'm on the corn side. Oh my God, what did you put in my lunch? Brought me over. Beth, you were going to say something.
I was going to say that, I think that the problem as well is it's not sort of like, here's the study, or like, here's the issue, and then we have both sides, and we're going to study it. What's happened in agriculture as well is that you have such intensive funding for certain kinds of research and certain kinds of products, and the other side, if you will, the more organic, the more sustainable is what I would call it, that there's actually very little funding that's going towards a lot of that. It's skewed so gigantically that's part of the problem. I think that the trust doesn't only come from like, oh, well, this is bad science. It's like, where is the science over here? Why don't we actually hear more about ways of doing things that, and again, it comes back, people say, well, you can't feed the world. Well, we actually haven't studied it to the point where people could actually say that.
Can I just say one thing? I think a lot of what this goes back to is limited money for research and science. And the point that industry is the only one that has the money to conduct these studies, and that government can't afford to do that. And so I think that raises a bigger question about limited money in science in general, and kind of having those resources. And industry has to be particular about where it puts its resources just as much as government does, and just as much as NGOs do. And so they're making a conscious decision that this is what our consumers tell us that they want, and so that's what we're going to do. You can dislike that, and I think a lot of people do, but that's unfortunately just
This is again back to that great conversation that the gentleman from the University of Maryland put forward, that we do not fund public research into these things. And as much as I, like any other journalist, should be suspicious of industry-funded research, I wish I had the ability to have research done on the other side. So you're right, it's not fair, it's not even.
And I'm not saying that, I understand that industry, there's a vested interest in the products that you're creating, and that's where you do research. But I think that's where the trust issue lies.
The rear mic, please.
Well, I think the GMO question is one where in addition to all the problems of, people, money and so on having an influence. It's one where honest people really differ in terms of, people that really care about world hunger really are concerned on one side, and so there are very legitimate conflicts that haven't been resolved by science, but or at least not to the extent that people are comfortable with. There was a similar issue that's been discussed by other folks in past events here, like the corn ethanol and biofuel issues, where there were immense money interests involved. It was researched well. There were huge, problems from the standpoint of world hunger, huge problems from the standpoint of the environment, which were documented well and reported well in the news. You could find it, a lot of news stories that really told the story very accurately based on, quoting the science and so on. So it seems to me that we've kind of gotten hung up on a very controversial, difficult issue, and nobody's really talked about some of the areas where the media, I think, really did well on tough issues, and maybe that's been underreported. I mean, people are sort of, we seem to be hung up on one particular difficult, controversial issue, and not talking about other issues that may be, vastly more important, where there's a lot more, agreement in terms of what to do about it.
We'll take that criticism. Thank you. Let's go to the front, Mike. You were standing there.
Hi, yes. So we've talked a lot about the interests of industry and nonprofits on both sides in terms of educating the public. But what about the interests of journalists themselves in terms of getting viewership or numbers on blogs, the desire to have headlines that really stand out to get people to read? So how do you take all these biases into consideration? And when you're writing or reporting, even choosing which scientific articles to incorporate. As a graduate student in public health, I spent an entire year just learning how to read scientific articles, which anyone who knows, they're very complicated in many ways that science can be weak or strong. So in that process of relaying the information from the science through journalism to the public, it's not just the industry and the nonprofits that have interest, but also journalism in itself.
You're looking to get a lot of hits to the blog. A different area of specialty in journalism might be a better plan. So I think I think people who do this are interested in it. But you bring up a really good point. The science is difficult. In some of the cases, legislation is difficult. Farm bill, with the Farm bill, with Obamacare, I mean, I had to dedicate a staff member to say, first you read it, which is kind of often just useless because it doesn't get you anywhere, but then you know it. You attend everything that's held about it, and you go to these things. It is, to Beth's point, it's very hard when you're not full-time and you can't devote resources. I work for a news organization where I can pluck a person and say, this is now going to be your beat in your area of specialty, and you need to learn this, and you need to understand and dig out where the spin is and where the story really is and whether the other side is valid. But that is expensive and time-consuming work.
Well, to your point of, titles and blog hits, that is what it's about. From, I get paid by the hit. So, I mean, it does make sense. It's in my best interest to get people there. Oddly, what people like to read, it's making good titles is a strange art that I wouldn't claim that I actually know how to do well. But people oddly like numbers, like 5 ways to eat better. People love that on a blog.
Lists are very popular.
Yeah, I mean, if you put GMO in a title, you're more likely to get hits. But outside of that, there's not really a whole lot that I've found. I mean, I'm sure there's people who specialize in it, but there's not a lot of, clear, like, wow, I'm going to get so many hits from this. It's a very difficult thing to do.
I mean, going to a different point, I think the point you made about scientific literacy among journalists is an important one, because there's so many studies and there's so much information out there, and unfortunately a lot of journalists don't necessarily have scientific backgrounds, and so I think there's a very steep learning curve, and I don't know how you get around that. I do think that there are growing efforts in journalism to encourage scientific like education behind that, because yes, it is our jobs to effectively, take these very scientific studies and then translate them into a way that is palatable for a general audience, because it's important. And so I think there is an effort in journalism to turn around that. And that there's also a lot of good, especially in Washington, there's a lot of very good kind of policy publications that are in the weeds and do really spend a lot of time on the science behind it. And Politico, not so much, because we look at the policy angle. But I think there is a growing movement in journalism to have journalists who are scientifically literate. And unfortunately, we're probably at the very front end of it, and so we're not seeing it quite as much as we need to. But I do think there is effort there to have scientifically literate journalists.
Can I just add real quickly? I mean, science isn't the only technical area where journalists sometimes fall down on the job. And as a real policy wonk and a lawyer, I can tell you how many times I've been frustrated when a journalist gets the law wrong. And, you don't like to tell journalists who got something wrong, but, I'm often just advocating on behalf of lawyers for bringing our voices into the conversation. I mean, it is obviously very challenging to unpack the Farm Bill, but it's important that we do that for everyone to really understand how important that type of policy is to how we eat.
Yep. Rear mic, please.
Hello, my name's Claire Thorpe. I work for CropLife America. And I have a question. I was hoping you could help me understand something. I've worked as an academic. I worked for the Irish government, and one of the things I managed was the Irish Food and Food Safety Research Programme. And now I work representing the pesticide industry, so it's been interesting. One of the things, we spoke about a food renaissance earlier, and I want to contextualize this because as a European, to me, renaissance means that point of change when you go from using perceptions and dogma to drive the decisions you make and start to move towards science to help you understand and influence the decisions that you make. And I'm kind of personally vested in this because I'm left-handed, and they used to burn people as witches if they were female and left-handed. So, it's kind of, I find this kind of important. What I would really like you help me understand is why is it that we seem to be so keen on having technological advance in other parts of our life? We like it when we get new medicines and new ways of treating disease. We like it when we get a car that has ABS and GPS and every other kind of S. But when it comes to agriculture, we seem to want to stop the technological development, even if this technological development has conferred massive benefits. And I'm talking about environmental benefits here because GM, for example, has reduced carbon footprint and has preserved soil structure in a way that ploughing cannot and will never do, for example. So could you help me understand why it is that within the field of agriculture and food, we seem to want to move back in time rather than forward in time? Why we want to stop farmers from using technologies based on our perception of how food should be, instead of allowing them to use the technologies that are available to them according to how they understand they want to produce their and manage their land. Thank you.
I'll just jump in real quick and say again, it's about values, and people place a very different type of value on food that they're ingesting, that they're feeding their children. Some people think about it this way, right? This is fundamental to parenting, right? The food I'm giving my children. I mean, that to me is not even in the same plane of conversation as my iPhone. I mean, of course, people want to take advantage of technology to do the things we want to do that make our lives easier, but food, to a lot of people, doesn't need technology in some of the ways that it's being talked about. And I do think people don't understand, of course, that we've been engaged in all kinds of agricultural advances to get to the place to give us the foods that we have now. But I just, again, it's these talking points that I hear over and over that I feel like are just not, like just saying, well, it's just like the iPhone. It's not really like the iPhone at all.
Go ahead. I think Michele is definitely right in the fact that it's food, and food is different. Like, everybody eats. It's just one of those things where not necessarily everybody needs to own an iPhone. I also think it's a separation from the land. Kind of we all moved off of the farm half a century ago, and now aren't related to that. And I also think that there's an aspect of it, especially when it comes to biotechnology, where it's hard for a consumer who lives in Washington, D.C. and shops at Whole Foods because it's the closest grocery store, to understand that when a crop is genetically engineered to understand the benefits of creating a glyphosate-resistant crop, for example. And I think there's a disconnect on that as well. And so I think that scares people. It goes back to the communications issue. But I think at its core, it's because it's food and everybody eats. And that's unfair because
It's more than
your
that
job
everybody
is
eats, because a lot of people use computers. I think it's more that people have an emotional attachment to food that runs so much deeper than what kind of computer I'm using. I mean, they're just fundamentally different topics.
So to add to that too, so I don't think that anybody who is talking about organics and sustainable agriculture and whatever group of terms you want to put there is talking about not using technology. I think that is a really misunderstood concept. We're not talking about like, okay, we're afraid of it. We're now not going to.
I don't even know that people draw that line. I've not ever heard that line drawn, that if I don't want genetically modified food, I'm against technology. It's the outcome of the food.
I think it has a lot more to do with chemicals.
Wait, are you disagreeing there?
Well, what I wanted to
You think that people who don't like GM are otherwise, that it's the technology that's the problem?
I think people don't like GM for a variety of reasons. My aunt, for example, who lives in Switzerland, was concerned about the developing country aspect of it. My concern grows when we start to use perception and values as a way of driving what we want to see in our regulations. Because there was a time long ago when we used to believe certain things, and therefore people wouldn't sail any further than something around the road.
I have to question the premise of the question. I don't think that's the driving force. I don't think there's any sense of let's keep things the way they are and let's keep that little red barn. I think this is highly specific. Everybody knows technology advances their food needs. I'm not sure that the link exists.
Yeah, so the part that I would like to add is that it's a lot about the chemical use. I think people are very alarmed about adding more chemicals. And I think this is something that we don't talk enough about, particularly in the press, is use of pesticides and chemicals and what the impacts are, if any, or what the studies say. But I think that when we're talking about chemicals, we're talking about living things. So we're talking about animals and plants. We're not talking about inert substances and that we have in our house as a computer, and that we ingest them. So I think that there's some very different distinctions here that people make, and that it's not like a blanket. I don't think, and I do also think that lots of people should think much more closely about their smartphones and where do those things come from and what are the implications of the metals in my phone and who's dying across the world because of that. So I would say that the premise for different reasons of your question I think is a little bit off.
My name is Paul Penner.
Move in a little bit to the mic.
My name is Paul Penner. I'm the president of National Association of Wheat Growers. I would respectfully disagree with those views because, number one, everybody's a beneficiary of biotechnology in medical research. I don't know anybody here that would, with the exception of maybe some people with certain beliefs, that would resist any research investment by biomedical companies because we know they save lives. And I think there is that disconnect. I think the conversation is legitimate with what the previous questioner asked, because it is important. It does save lives.
Yeah, I'm going to say this. I think you guys have to recast this issue of people who don't like GMO as Luddites. It's just not true. There are lots of people who can choose to not take any of those medications if they don't want. I can't not eat bread.
And can I just add,
I can't not eat rice. I can't not eat, I can choose not to eat those things, but I'm not going to, they're in the food system now. They're there. So I think there's and I respectfully disagree with you because I admire what you do, and that's why I'm here, and that's why and we cover this stuff. But there's definitely become this conception that if you don't like this particular part of technological advance in agriculture, you must not like technology in advance. And I truly think that that's just a misconception. In all my years of reporting on this, I've never come across let's not have GMO because we don't need advances. Let's go back to every other way of farming that I mean, I think that's, people are as disconnected as they may be from their food, they're not that disconnected. They know the technology.
And also, it's not just consumers. I feel this is another false dichotomy that gets made, right? It's again, the dumb anti-technology consumers against the smart scientists who know what's best for them. Well, it's actually a lot of farmers who object to this technology. And in Oregon, on Tuesday, 2 ballot measures were passed in counties there, spearheaded by small farmers who want to see genetic technology banned in those counties. So, you know, I really think that we need to not be thinking this about consumers not knowing what they're talking about when there are farmers who are leading the charge in some cases against this technology.
I kind of do want to make one point to that, though, and I think the other problem that the biotechnology industry as a whole runs into is again, having people so far removed from the land and from farming, and so they don't understand the existing agricultural technologies that go into hybrid crops and advanced breeding technologies and all of those things, and so they don't see that they see it almost, I think, and I could be wrong about this, that it's kind of GMOs is the technology. And so they don't realize that there's also all of these other technologies, and so that's why it's kind of been pinpointed so much, if that makes sense. So I think that's part of it, and so it unfairly falls on this one technology. But it's because of this kind of lack of knowledge of the rest of it.
My name is Phil McLean. I'm a farmer from North Carolina. I grow wheat, corn, soybeans, rapeseed, and sunflowers. And appreciate the dialogue we're having today. It's good for me to hear things that challenge me. But I would like to set the record just a little bit straight about a comment made earlier about us using more chemicals, because the biotechnology that we have today has caused me to use less chemicals, a lot less chemicals. And for people who believe in climate change, our carbon footprint is a lot less because the technology that we have now is causing me to make fewer trips across the field, saving resources, saving water, saving soil. So we're using a lot less chemicals. And so, you know, I just want to set the record straight on that.
I think that is that a reaction to what I said. I don't think I was indicating that there was more. I think that that's part of what consumers are fighting against.
So that might be a good argument for the GMO folks to clarify a little bit more. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Go ahead.
Hi, Carol Kokendorfer again. You know, I'm going to point my finger at each one of you. Each one of us here in this room lives in a silo, and you all are reporting in silos as well. Contextually, this technology cuts across all your silos. And we live in the biotech century, and where in agriculture, our discussion on biotech is distinct and separate with what's happening with biotech in other sectors, such that every morning we wake up and we drink a glass of water, purified through enzymes that are from biotechnology. We are wearing clothes, that blue, the dye in that blue shirt, Jenny, came from dyes that are biotech. Our pharmaceutical products, biomedicines, Enbrel. I gave blood the other day for Red Cross. That's biotechnology. So when we look at this, technology, we have to look that we are now in a century where we're no longer looking at organic chem alone. We have evolved to the biotech century. It's been blazoned across the New York Times, Business Week. But we in agriculture continue to look biotech as if it's the only application of this technology. Frankly, when you see what's going on in biotech and these other sectors, it's almost sad how little it's progressed in this sector to some of the discussion that's been had. But we are very much ahead. 20 years ago this month, the Flavor Saver tomato was developed. And we have moved so far in other areas in biotechnology, except in food. I think if consumers had that broader awareness that every morning when they brush their teeth, that water is purified with biotech enzymes, that they put on beautiful clothes that came from biotech enzymes, that Thursday happy hour margarita came from biotech enzymes. They start realizing where this technology plays, and it's a tool. It is not a food. And I think that is something that needs to be understood.
It's a very good point, and I think it speaks to what you said earlier, Michele, that the less we can, or the more we can depolarize this discussion, the better basic facts like that come out and can make their way into the discourse. The issue I think you're hearing from us as people who cover it is that this is a very polarized discussion, and many parties are to blame for how polarized it is on both sides of it. And perhaps the gain we think, or I'm speaking for Michele because this is what I heard you say, but I think would be had by figuring out a way to, let me put it this way, uncable news the discussion, you know, where there are people on this side and this side, and have this conversation, which is the one that's going on in this room, right? Where nobody in this room is here and here necessarily. We're kind of all over here. And you just made, you know, a really great point that actually maybe we're more over here because we're using this all the time everywhere else. And I think it relates to that last point about from the woman from CropLife at the back who was talking about our embrace of technology elsewhere versus our seemingly lack of embrace. I think most of us are here. And I think the debate goes on over here. And if everybody involved in the debate can make it their business to bring it over here, we'll probably get further with it.
I would just add real quickly, since you were speaking for me, but I want to speak for myself and say I appreciate that perspective, and I think it's one that most people don't understand. And I think, you know, I think someone made the case earlier, but perhaps the reason for the distinction is that the case for the use of biotech in food as a benefit to consumers just hasn't been made. So while we may, yeah, I know you don't think so, but
Consumers are constantly, excuse me.
Please.
I hear this all the time. Consumers are constantly talking about sustainability, environmentally friendly, living in a socially responsible community. And I have a hard time thinking of reduced environmental loading, reduced water use, all the environmental benefits. Yeah, they may accrue directly to the farmers, but indirectly to consumers. Isn't that what they're saying when we had the earlier panel about sustainability? They want those products. They want to live in oneness of one health world.
I hear what you're saying, and I would just say, unfortunately, we don't live in you know, not all decisions are made rationally, you know, and that's, I mean, it's.
And I don't know that we're all going to like come to one consensus in it all. Like we might all have.
We may just have to accept that we're not going to come to a consensus on this. I think the evidence might support that. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I have to thank you for, I asked for you all to be engaged, and you certainly have been. And we've had some really, really great discussion on this. And I think as journalists, we've certainly heard you, and it will inform our journalism. And I thank you for that. So normally I thank the panelists, but I'm going to thank you for all of the work you've done in really giving us some insights into some of the concerns that you have. And I will thank the panelists. Thank you all.